Why don't we get started? Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 annual Sophia lecture, Endowed lecture. It's the only Endowed lecture that is going on this year. The other three backed out because of the pandemic. So we're very fortunate that Jasmine was so accommodating and resilient and agreed to do this through Zoom. So a little bit of history about the Sophia lectureship. It's our youngest, most recent endowed lecture, and it was funded by an anonymous GW Philosophy Department alumna with the hope of supporting early to mid-career women and or underrepresented or philosophers from underrepresented groups. This alumna went on to be a philosophy professor herself, and she really wanted us to recognize excellent scholarship of younger women through this public lecture that would advance their careers. So our hope is that the Sophia lecture will inspire other philosophy departments to likewise showcase the scholarship of women and minority philosophers. So that's the history. And I'm very happy to have Jasmine Syedullah be our Sophia lecturer this year. So I will turn over what is this called? The camera, I guess, to my colleague, Vanessa Wills, who will do a full introduction of Jasmine. Take it away, Vanessa.
Great. Well, thank you for that background about what brings us here, and well, thank you to everybody who came out on a Friday afternoon. I'm very, very excited that we have Jasmine Syedullah here. So, Jasmine K. Syedullah is, in her own eloquent words, a Black feminist political theorist of abolition. This description beautifully describes both the breadth and interdisciplinarity of her work and its laser sharp focus. We see the breadth of Professor Sydullah's interests and evidence in the university spaces she has inhabited throughout her education and career. She is currently Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Vassar College. In fact, she is the first, right, in a groundbreaking move, she is the first Assistant Professor of Africana Studies at Vassar. She received her PhD in politics at UC Santa Cruz with a designated emphasis in feminist studies and history of consciousness. She earned her BA at Brown University in religious studies with a focus in Buddhist philosophy. Professor Syedullah weaves these skills and specializations together in her scholarship. She is the co-author of the 2016 book Radical Dharma: Talking Race, Love, and Liberation. And I first became aware of Professor Sydullah's research about 6 years ago when I met her at a meeting of the Collegium of Black Women Philosophers. There, she presented a paper titled Harriet Jacobs's Philosophy of Wrong and Other Abolitionist Loopholes. I was and remain, right, deeply impressed by the way Professor Syedullah engages with an author very little discussed in academic philosophy and compellingly makes the case that this is a thinker whose contributions belong more squarely in the forefront of our theorizing about the meaning of freedom. As Professor Syedullah writes, her current research intervenes in the field of political theory to ask how the carceral logics of modern freedom are challenged by captive Black women's demands for abolition. When the Sophia Lecture Committee convened to decide whom we would invite to be our speaker this year, Jasmine Sydullah's work leapt to mind. Her work is deep, creative, searching, and even delightful and surprising. But especially in these times, when abolitionist politics are more widely discussed and perhaps more obviously urgent to more people than they have been in quite some while, I'm extraordinarily grateful and pleased that Professor Syedullah is here to speak with us. Philosophy rooted in an abolitionist politics is, in my opinion, precisely what we need more of. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to present today's speaker to you, and I invite you to join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Jasmine K. Syedullah, who will speak to us about the question, is this self truly mine to own? A Black feminist politics of abolition from within the hold. So thank you, Professor Syedullah.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's such an honor to be here. Thank you, Tad, for that context about the lecture series, and Gail and Vanessa for being on the committee that made this possible, selecting me out of so many worthy folks. There's so many folks doing, this is part of what is exciting about this time, is that there are so many people thinking through the work of the abolitionist tradition from a variety of perspectives. And so I'm just really honored that this is one that you wanted to bring into conversation with you all today. So thank you to the philosophy department. I'm a fugitive from philosophy in a lot of ways. I started out as a philosophy major and at Brown University, and just fell in love. And really, I fell in love with philosophy way back in high school as an ancient Greek student, translating Plato's Ion. That was in a ice cream shop on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn, and with my professor. It was just an eye-opening experience, and beginning to think more deeply about the fact that perception is contested and that we might be able to contribute to the contestation in ways that are ethical, in ways that are reparative, and in ways that are urgently needed. I think that's what abolition is for me. So thank you all so much for having me. It's a real honor to be in community and conversation with you. And I'm actually going to change my view so I can still see all of your faces, because part of the joy of this is that you can actually see every single one. You don't have to get blinded by lights and things like that. Yes, but thank you so much. It's been an honor to think through with Vanessa, like how to bring, what to bring. And so I'm going to introduce you to a bit of the work that I've been doing. And we'll reflect a little bit on this notion of self-making, selfhood, and self-defense that's so central to issues of feminist theory, political theory, and carceral study. And doing so through the narrative of Harriet Jacobs, I think, can be really generative. So I want to begin this talk with an acknowledgement and deep recognition of those prophetic Black feminists without whose embodied activism and engaged scholarship my own understanding of what freedoms could be possible or inhabitable within the hold of slavery would be absolutely impossible. These are the women who use their access to higher education, to literacy, to study, to return to the archives, letters, narratives, witness, and testimonies of those who came before them, to author their own, to keep their own accounts of what counts, and to really tell the times according to their embodied direct experience of it. They believed, despite an absence of much evidence, that the women who lived in bondage had insights to pass on, understandings and learnings about freedom that might be necessary to future generations, insights on how to overcome the kinds of shackles and containment that the end of slavery would never be able to abolish. In the academy, I'm sending up appreciations for Paula Giddings, Dorothy Steerling, Angela Davis, Joy James, Stephanie Camp, Gina Dent, and countless others. These are the women who saw something worth studying in the daily acts of enslaved women, and they studied them to better understand how to struggle for their own freedom as academics, as human beings. I'm also wanting to just take a moment to acknowledge all of the mothers, just in a moment of, being so close in proximity to my own, only 10 miles away, but not having seen her in some time to protect her, almost a year. Just really appreciating the learnings that come not just from academic feminists, but from our mothers, from our aunts, from our grandmothers, from our sisters, and the folks who really keep the kind of practice of self-defense and self-care in a continuity of inheritance that is rich and life-giving and life-affirming, against all odds. Like, really, there should be no self-care, healing justice emanating from Black feminists in this moment. We should all have given up by now. And yet we haven't, and we persist. And there's something of an alchemy in that is just incredible. And so I just want to honor that and name that, because without it, I would not care to do this work at all, or not, I wouldn't have the capacity. So I really start the work of thinking with Jacobs, with thinking with this category of the fugitive and what the fugitive makes possible. And the fact that the fugitive has become such a flashpoint for Black study is really exciting to me. And I think it's important for us who are interested in theorizing the role or the generative capacity of the fugitive to remember that the fugitive never existed in isolation, always in community, always in community. There was no fugitivity without collectivity, right? However, this is also the case that the condition of the formerly enslaved has been a matter of concern and contention since the first African people slipped the yoke of those who stole them from the place they called home and brought them in chains to Turtle Island, as it was known. However, they managed to escape their captivity, that modern political status of stolen enslaved human property, be it as truant, fugitive, maroon, manumitted, conscripted, enlisted, emancipated, freeborn, or US born, no protocol of liberation completely abolished the mark of slavery seared on black flesh in stolen lands. And that trajectory of from truant to natural born citizen, I think is an important one to delineate. In the course that I'm teaching right now on abolitionist theory, we're doing a Bible study, I'm calling it, of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, just reading a little bit every week and really approaching it as a text that has become in some ways the prophetic gospel of abolition and the abolitionist tradition. And what Du Bois is so helpful in getting us to trace is the evolution of personhood in status from truant to fugitive to maroon, from manumitted to conscripted soldier to enlisted soldier, to emancipated person, to freeborn, and then to US born, while tracking how that mark of slavery never fully vanishes, right? It gets carried forward even as liberation is granted and secured, so in law, if not in practice. We all are living in the wake of a social, political, economic, and effective reliance on the institution of slavery to keep us safe as a nation, to present Christina Sharp's work. And in this way, the presence of the past persists into the future of freedom despite our relative distance from the time of slavery's abolition more than 150 years ago. Its constitutive force remains a part of the structural integrity of the logical and social formation of contemporary gender, class, and racial power relations today. In the words of formerly enslaved mother and abolitionist author and activist Harriet Jacobs, until we understand that the condition of the formerly enslaved was and continues to be something akin to freedom, our reading of the wrongs of slavery will be incomplete. So a Black feminist political theory of abolition from below, this talk takes up the unfinished work of abolition as a project rooted in the work and witness of many, many fugitive slave abolitionists, but among them Jacobs, and returning to the themes of propriety, respectability, and embodied power that organized orientations to both enslavement and freedom in the antebellum era. This talk really comes out of a larger book project that's tentatively titled Beyond Garroted Freedom, Abolition Through the Loophole of Jacobs Incidents, in which I read incidents through a critical carceral studies lens and place Jacobs, both the literary figure and the historical subject, at the intersections of intimacy, domesticity, and self-defense that originate in the fields of both feminist studies and political theory. Though Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is a well-known and often cited cornerstone of African-American literature, its author, protagonist, Harriet Jacobs, is generally recognized as a somewhat less radical figure within the abolitionist tradition. While figures such as Mariah Stewart, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner's Truth leadership represents a trailblazing, gender nonconforming working edge of the antebellum movement and the women's rights movement, of course. As escaped formerly enslaved mother, a seamstress, and domestic laborer by trade, I argue that Harriet Jacobs represents a lineage of proto-Black feminist abolitionist praxis that emerges quite literally from within the master's house. So a house Negro, perhaps we might say in Malcolm X's terms, Jacobs was educated, well-read, deeply invested in upholding the respectability politics that govern the choices of women, the cult of true womanhood, as it was called, far above her station. However, unlike Brother Malcolm's foil, Jacobs supported the immediate and uncompensated abolition of slavery by whatever means necessary. In fact, she supported Nat Turner's rebellion, which was 2 weeks ago in abolitionist theory, and wanted to end her narrative with a call for armed uprising and a solidarity with Harper's Ferry, with John Brown's Harper's Ferry, and her editor encouraged her to not do that, that the women of the North, the white women of the North to whom she was appealing might not see that as like a sentimental point of connection and empathy. And so instead she ended the narrative with a remembrance of her grandmother. But this is part of the story, is that though she's seen as domesticated in many ways, the way that she occupies domestic space is armed. And it's really important for us as we begin to think about what resistance meant, what freedom meant to fugitive slaves, to think about not only the kinds of desires that they might have had, but also the different kinds of tools, the weapons of the weak that they might have been employing in their defense. Not all of them are necessarily ammunition-based firearms. So unlike Brother Malcolm's foil, Jacobs supported the immediate and uncompensated abolition of slavery by whatever means possible, and thus, although aligned with Quaker principles, rejected nonviolence when it came to the cause of the enslaved. A lot of folks in the North who are fugitive slaves endorse this idea of immediate abolition, uncompensated emancipation. Nevertheless, her narrative of escape from slavery did not turn on a pivotal act of direct physical confrontation, as did the narrative of her literary counterpart, Frederick Douglass. Rather, Jacobs' escape from slavery was protracted, shaped more by cunning than climax, an unlikely family affair involving both immediate kin and the close friends and accomplices trusted enough to keep her beyond reach of the patrols and bounty hunters. Her freedom, such as it was the deferred realization of previous generations, those then living and those already passed on. Though her story ends with freedom, the dream of her life, the freedom that she wanted, a home for herself and for her children, remains an as yet unrealized reality, both at the end of her story and ours, as it is the case today that more than 500,000 people in the United States alone, at least half of these, the racial descendants of the formerly enslaved, cannot access a place of their own, a home to properly protect and pass on to future generations. And a lot of the work that I do in prison studies, so I work in prison studies as part of Africana studies, and have been working really closely for nearly 20 years. That's weird, with this group of activist educators, popular education, just rock stars, called the Poverty Scholars. And they are working out of the Bay Area, and they're people who are directly impacted by poverty and incarceration and houselessness. And they are creating not only analysis about poverty, nothing about us without us, kind of analysis, activist-based knowledges that are entering the academy in robust ways. They've created popular education curriculum, they've created textbooks. Unfortunately, my partner snagged my copy, otherwise I would, I would put it up, but I'll put it in the chat a little later, the name of the textbook. But they've created an incredible archive of analysis to help those of us in the academy who are interested in studying poverty and houselessness, and to do so with accountability, to draw on work that lifts up those most directly impacted by these things, instead of reproducing the objectification and extraction that happens in the socioeconomic disenfranchisement of capitalism itself. But then again, when we study them, right, when we study these phenomenon. So I owe a lot of my ability to connect between this history of slavery and gentrification and houselessness to the poverty scholars in the Bay Area and the work that they've done to really keep their own account of what counts and to tell their own stories. So Jacobs' escape from slavery is unconventional in that it begins, oh, and by the way, the mother of this entire outfit of poverty scholars, her favorite book is Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, which I just thought was remarkable. And I did not know that when I started writing about the two of them together, but it's a neat connection. So Jacobs' escape from slavery is unconventional in that it begins with a 7-year period of secreted concealment, as many of you may know. Then again, it begins when she leaves her garroted space, her garroted freedom, for flight north to the Free States. Her story of escape could end there, but instead it begins once again when she and her children escape the grasp of the fugitive slave law and threats of being sold back south with manumission. With manumission of freedom bought of bill of sale, the gift of a friend who wanted her freedom more than the capital her captivity cost. Again and again and again, her escape takes place. It commences. So Jacobs' escape from slavery does not end here, though her narrative does. Her escape from the hold of slavery begins again when she agrees to write her life as a testament against enslavement on behalf of those millions still in bondage. After much trial, the slave narrative is published on the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the same year Vassar is founded, and her escape from slavery begins again, this time against the backdrop of national reckoning, armed rebellion, administering to the wounded, reporting on the captive exodus, and sending missives up to Garrison from the front lines of the Civil War. After the war, Jacobs returns to the South with her daughter to meet the dawn of emancipation, bringing whatever support she can to the efforts of Black Reconstruction. Though her life ends in 1907, Jacobs' escape from slavery begins again, more than half a century after her book is published, as Black feminists took it up as evidence that Black women resisted their gendered captivity and domestication, despite the fact that the beloved narrative had long been misrecognized as an improbable work of fiction. So for about 100 years, Jacobs' authorship was not authenticated and seen as a hoax. The life of Jacobs' abolitionism, and thus that of her gift to us, Incidents, details a praxis of escape that has no resolve, no redemption, no end. Because there is no escape from the time of slavery for the formerly enslaved, the most direct confrontation she offers up as evidence of her refusal is to begin again. And so we do. In this book, I return to Jacobs in search of how we take up the unfinished work of abolition and begin again today, here, now, with every breath and every moment. I did this earlier today, for sure. In the wake of #MeToo and #Black Lives Matter, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl is a slave narrative arc that teaches us a movement is not a moment, as the rallying cry suggests, but a series of incidents, everyday apertures in the endless loop of logic that binds freedom to propriety and innocence, to the proper order of taste and speech and comportment upheld by the ruling class. The power to begin the work of abolition again and again, not just as a social movement, but as a congregational praxis of dialogical reimagining freedom beyond the binary of bondage and mastery, beyond the security narrative from captive to capture. It is an invitation to retreat into the settler colonial dialectics that domesticate to dominate, into the intimate truths such sequestered spaces of proximity to power contain. Within the master's house, whispers Jacobs between the lines, lies the keys to escaping the time of slavery, haunting and afterlives, dismantling from the inside. Jacobs retreats through the loopholes of slavery's hold on Black flesh, futures, and fancy. And it is, I argue, a realization of abolitionist time that sits within the cartography of her containment, but remains just enough out of their reach to provide us the loophole of protection such perspective secures. All right, so I want to slow down a little bit here. So this idea that Jacobs retreats through the loophole of slavery's hold on Black flesh, futures, and fantasies is a realization of abolitionist time, is to me a way of thinking about dialectics in a way that is not about overturning what came before, right? It's more about repair than overcoming. And so part of what I'm playing with here, of course, is a play on the master-slave dialectic and understanding what dialectics look like when mobilized through an embodied relationship to both gender and race and historical contexts of enslavement. This past week in abolitionist theory, we were reading about marriage, and I gave them a couple of chapters from Neil Roberts' the precedent to freedom as marriage, his dissertation. I actually went back to his dissertation, and it was so lovely to see how he was thinking through this notion of marriage as a dialectical movement, but as a dialectical movement that's happening in the midst of messiness, right? In the midst of nonlinearity, in the midst of irresolvable harm, right? And so the idea that, the momentum of the dialectic isn't a corrective and it isn't determinate is really exciting to me. And I hope that you all ask questions later on that push me in thinking about this a little bit more. So as the end of Incident suggests, I want to believe that unmarked portals to abolitionist futures contain as yet unrealized treasure, buried within the dreams and witness of abolitionists' pasts, secreted fugitive missives of a kind of freedom to come, uncharted timelines that live on within the narrative testimonies, letters, memoirs, speeches, and essays of those who dared to retreat, escape, and liberate themselves from the bonds of bondage. However, arrested realizations abound in the advent of the American Civil War, both those of the formerly enslaved and the arrested realizations of those entitled to speculate on and profit from their capture and commodification. So I'm saying this dialectic isn't just the property of Black resistance, right? That this movement of realization might actually, travel regardless of what body one is in. And how can we then use that movement of a dialectic through realization to think a little bit differently about the time of slavery? So while the tireless baseline of abolition time is to begin again and begin again, again and again, so too does the time of slavery follow a beat of the same drum. From slavery by another name to the new Jim Crow to the new Jim Code, literatures attesting to the recurrent force of the afterlives of slavery show there is no end to its hold. A mood of pessimism, however, Incidents asks we understand what persistent logic as logic as it moves both from both above and below. Assuming there is still time to honor the arrested realizations of abolition past, this book project links slavery's erasures as sites of uncharted and unknown possibility that remain within what others might call progress. Let me see. This book links slavery's erasures as sites of uncharted and unknown possibility as things that remain within what others might call progress. So yeah, and we'll come back to that idea in a second. All right, so bringing Jacobs' retreats of realization into conversation with the longue durée of abolitionist time requires that we read incidents as part of a prophetic tradition of deep liberatory praxis, one in which racially subjected, domesticated captive genders born of slavery and its afterlives hold the key to seeding a kind of freedom that holds beyond what I call the carceral politics of respect, representation, and even recognition. What Jacobs and her kin teach us is an embodied praxis of co-creating and recreating a kind of freedom born of learning to leave the master's house, not just as a singular event, but as an ongoing practice, and realizing sense that what must be dismantled, to turn a popular phrase of Audre Lorde's on his head, is not just once, but as many times as it takes, is not just his house, but so too all his tools, those millions still in bondage, and those descendants who strive to escape the smell of smoking flesh. So then to be free, or by being free, by being captive and bearing responsibility for the freedom of future generations, Jacobs' incidents asks us to sit with her deep within the interstices of a realizing sense of what we might call, bringing hooks to bear here, the white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchal logic that lives within a freedom born of stolen bodies on stolen land. While surviving is as traumatizing as suffering, life becomes a series of incidents whereby the freedom we have is that which lies in the choice of the ways that we would rather suffer. I would rather isolate myself in a 7x9x3 garret space for 7 years with no insulation, with very little air to breathe, as she says, rather than stay on a plantation and be free in that way, right? Free from that kind of physical captivity. There's another moment in the narrative where her owner, the person who owns her freedom, says, well, if you consent to become my sexual slave, my concubine, I'll make you even more protected. I'll put you in a house of your own. You'll be far away from my wife, that you won't be hunted down and killed, hopefully. Like, he was really trying, he was like, you'll be released from manual labor, as will your children. I can grant you all of this security if you give up your freedom, right? And so there are moments when she has options. And I think it's really important to remember there is some kind of agency in those options, even if it's not the kind of agency we would like for ourselves. There is choice. The fact that she chooses a kind of captivity that marks her body for the rest of her life. She does not recover from the injuries that she incurs in that garret space for 7 years. Over slavery suggests quite a bit, and it becomes a way of thinking differently about what it means to move closer to freedom in the contemporary moment. To what degree is that analogy of the garroted freedom that she has instructive to the kinds of ways that we perhaps opt for garroted freedoms in the contemporary moment? Okay, so yes, so I'm gonna go back to the text now, because if I keep doing this, I will not actually get through my little half-hour speech in an hour. Okay, so let's see. So when surviving is as traumatizing as suffering, life becomes a series of incidents whereby the freedom we have is that which lies in the choice of the ways we would rather suffer. as the embodiment of the democratic contradiction upon which the US empire was built. And I really see Jacobs as the embodiment of that democratic contradiction, right? Jacobs animates an orientation to the abolitionist tradition that often, though often read as redemptive or heroic, is actually emblematic of the scandal of double consciousness that keeps the condition of the formerly enslaved like a cancer, ever entangled with the future of US empire, which is why that litany of subjecthoods that mark the formerly enslaved is never redemptive. It's never ameliorative completely, because that subjecthood of Blackness is bound up in the future of US empire, and therefore can never be released from that history, that logic. So the question that drives this work asks, if the political independence of those with no selves to defend is insufficient to secure equal rights and protection under the law, what kinds of freedom might the formerly enslaved have been fighting for or be fighting for? Do their political desires still shape the contours and compromise of our own? Like, in this particular moment, I would say absolutely. How might the carceral conceits of democratic inclusion and belonging that Black people face today in public, at home, in parks, on the road, at work, become more than spaces of foreclosure, but become loopholes in the unceded time of slavery, sites from which to reset the clock of the world, to revive the call from Gracely Boggs and begin again? So one of the big questions that I ask on the first day of abolitionist theory, and this work also comes out of my work with Radical Dharma, which isn't just a book, but we also go into community with different people all over the country to help them use contemplative practices to reckon with their own deep investments in US empire, white supremacy, and capitalism for their own sense of safety, and how we can begin to free ourselves, free our minds and spirits before we can, as we are working to free each other. So the question is, what time is it? What time is it? How do you know? Who decides? What time is it is a question that resonates to me from Gracely Boggs, of course, but also from the Black liberation movement, like call and response, what time is it, nation time, right? But coming from a Black feminist intervention to that question, I'm less interested in the kind of nation building projects that were seen as salvific for such a long time, to challenge ourselves to see how can we return to something again and again? How can we begin again and again without the structure of certainty and belonging and identity that the nation state provides? Is there another kind of protocol of intimacy of relation that we can ground in? And maybe it's an ideology, but I'm actually trying to think through it as something that is not just discursive, but is also practiced and embodied. And so when I think about what time is it, I think about that nation time, and I think about Assata Shakur's narrative as a kind of response and refusal that what time it is nation time, because her narrative, if you haven't spent some time with it, is so beautifully constructed in this way that helps you understand that, you know, the kind of freedom that we want probably does not yet exist. And that in order to even begin to critique the kinds of freedom that we've inherited, we have to deeply sit with the trauma, terror, and violence that is politics as usual in the US empire. And so it's no accident that she occupies the top 10 list of Americans' most wanted terrorists, because she is threatening the integrity of the project of American empire in ways that continue to reverberate into the movements today as they chant her words as the heralding cry of the movement. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. So what time is it? And also reverberates through an understanding of abolition as a prophetic tradition, as a kind of theological exegesis. Like there is some kind of like messianism in abolition that I also want to signal with this question. But we're not going to get into all of that today. But I just want to unpack where it comes from a little bit before we go into it, because I tend to poetically signal without unpacking sometimes. So just want to bring you into conversation with that. So abolition is a practice of transforming one's sense of time. At their best, abolitionists become modern day prophets, knowing what time it is, owning it, and acting on it without apology or regard for the times they're in, whether they live in the time of slavery, mass incarceration, or a despotic dystopian dictatorship. Thank God that's not happening right this second. Here, abolitionist theory turns on time and challenges us to ask who writes the past, who reads the writing on the wall, and what did we use to tell time before this time? In sum, if we can only learn to tell time by the stories we have learned to tell, then who do we need to learn from in order to learn the times today? Whose stories do we need to read, and who can teach us how to read them? And I would argue, as an abolitionist, we need to be reading the stories and theories and testimonies of those most directly impacted by slavery, by prisons, by the prison industrial complex, by policing, by detention, by criminalization, by displacement and houselessness. This is why I teach prison studies, policing, and the justice system. My approach to the field of prison studies is unique, however, in that it's rooted in this Black feminist tradition of looking, reading, citing, translation, interpretation, and analysis that takes seriously that the reach of these prison systems cannot be contained by the institutions that house them. The logics of prisons and incarceration, what many of us call carceral logics, and social justifications for our reliance on policing to keep us safe, perpetuate cycles of dependence that extend far beyond brick and mortar prison walls into our communities, into our schools and housing and healthcare and childcare, social welfare. They serve and protect businesses and gentrification by sweeping up and incarcerating those whom racism and capitalism leave with inadequate resources. Incarcerating those without enough food, jobs, and shelter is never the most effective way to ensure public safety. But today, especially as we face the effects of a global pandemic, we are learning how intimately interdependent our personal well-being is on the health and well-being of those most vulnerable. And so, and that makes it seem like we're doing them a favor. I'm also trying to say that they are the people who are going to help get us through this period of time. And I think we're seeing, as you know, as the pandemic is starting to expose capitalism's habituation towards disposability, I'm hoping that this becomes an aperture, an opportunity, a portal through which we can carry a bearing of witness to these internal contradictions into the future of freedom in a new way, and really be bold enough to try new protocols of security, belonging, and inclusion that are not based on this idea of diversity that's like, I'm just going to stay my old, 1861 self, as Vassar College was founded, right? And I will invite you all in, but you can't really change me. I'm pretty much unchangeable, but you're happy to learn at my feet and become, benefit from the proximity to power that I've enjoyed for this time. Instead, it's an idea of diversity that's really born for me out of Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, where she says we have to embrace diversity or be destroyed. So it's not an ethics of sentimentality. It's an ethics of survival. It's incumbent upon us that we learn from those on the margins so that we all can survive. this moment, in this pandemic, the multiple pandemics of poverty and capitalism and settler colonialism, in addition to those of Corona and anti-Black violence and police brutality. So this is a Black feminist approach to prison study that asks us to consider how the reach of carceral logics into the everyday domains of Black and Brown people's lives, homes, families, and neighborhoods shape their life chances, their relationships, and their well-being, and likewise that of all of us, because we're interconnected. So our societal reliance on prisons and policing to keep us safe has become an embodied practice, and forms and policies will not be enough to transform this national tradition. Under pressure or threat of violence, we have been conditioned to reliance on reaction, one solution to cure all of the myriad and complex social problems. And it's the only practice we know, and this action is to call the police, literally or figuratively. This single act is the universal solution to a complex matrix of interrelated national investments in settler colonialism and the as yet unfolding legacy of slavery, capitalism, lynch culture, rape culture, and the disposability with which we compost the lives and labors of so many powerful caregivers in our culture. So then it's like, so how do we kind of lift up the caregivers? How do we lift up what care can do? And there's been a lot of conversation about self-care in movement spaces and in academic spaces. And I think there's still a lot of work that to be done in terms of naming what the alchemic force of care can be outside of a reproduction of carceral logics or capitalist logics. So poetry, song, art, movement, dance, sound, movement, all of these ways of sharing stories and keeping accounts of what counts are all the original methods of study for those who live on the margins and continue to challenge both academic theories and political practices of freedom today. What are their limits? Where are their constraints? How can we push their horizons of possibility just with our own witness and imagination? So testimony, narrative, and collective truth-telling contain this alchemic force. And I focus on alchemy because I have been inspired by the work of the Latina Feminist Collective, who write in the introduction to their collectively curated book, Telling to Live, Latina Feminist Testimonios, about telling our stories to each other, even more than writing them, though it can feel familiar, can really begin to break down the ways we compartmentalize parts of ourselves, not only for others, but in our own experience of ourselves. And they call this an alchemy of erasure. And I think about that as a kind of realizing dialectic as well, right? This kind of continual maintenance of white supremacy's veiling of the myriad truths that exist within the contents of its narratives of progress that are obviously not about progress. So by discussing our feelings of vulnerability and mistrust openly, we begin to build a space where we learn to listen, evaluate, and question each other in non-judgmental ways, they say. We learn to, this is the Latina Feminist Collective, we learned how to construct a safer space that was not assumed to be safe space simply on shared affinity of race or gender or national ethnic affiliations. Testimonio was critical for breaking down essentialist categories, since it was through telling life stories and reflecting on them that we gained nuanced understandings of differences and connections, actually lived ones among us, as opposed to just theoretical or categorical, as individuals and as Latinas. And we learned to translate ourselves for each other, which I think is a beautiful task. This is the work that Mariame Kaba is doing. And Mariame Kaba's book, of course, I also don't have that because these books are popular in my household. But Mariame Kaba just came out with We Do This Till We Free Us, which just got put on the New York Times bestseller list, which is to me a testament to the fact that people are willing to have these conversations about transformative justice, about alternatives to calling the police. And it is so exciting to me to be a part of this moment. I know that she's been working since the late 80s. You know, folks in critical resistance have been working since the late 90s. The movement for prison abolition has been being propelled by prison intellectuals and political prisoners since before the Attica uprising. And so this work has been in the pipeline for so long. Karen DeVries, who is here, is my friend and colleague from UC Santa Cruz, and both of us took classes with Angela Davis. And were both inspired and moved by the ways that she was working as both an activist and an academic to realize the dreams of freedom born from inside the Attica rebellion, right? These are the things that so anyway, so I get so excited. So as an abolitionist artist and activist, Mariame Kaba, director of Project Nia, teaches in lectures, essays, art exhibits, podcasts that selfhood is a privilege historically denied to racially marginalized women. Her work traces the de facto and de jure opposition to Black women's rights to personhood or personal protection under the law as a precursor to histories of gendered and racialized erasure that has left many who fight back and survive violence within the eyes of the law with no selves to defend. So this is a phrase that Kaba originated, no selves to defend, as a slogan, and it was taken up by grassroots movements organized in defense of Black women criminalized for defending themselves in the face of a clear and present danger to their lives, namely in defense of the New Jersey Four, Marissa Alexander, CeCe McDonald. Kaba curated an activist art exhibit of the same name in Chicago in 2014, along with activist Rachel Kydor, to raise defense funds for Marissa Alexander and put her case in larger historical context. So the exhibit employed visual art, song, music, and narrative, and art. Oh yeah, no, I said that. To tell the stories of Black and Brown women's struggles for sexual sovereignty, a struggle born of the plantation South against a legacy of violence that did not end with legal abolition, but survived the victory of constitutional emancipation and continues to authorize the punishment of survivors, and far more than just Black women, obviously, but survivors of sexual assault, of racial violence, of intimate partner violence today. Child sexual abuse. No Selves is an abolitionist practice of critique of the kinds of freedom that requires so many of us to remain captive, to remain silenced, to manage our feelings rather than address the direct impact of trauma caused by sexual misconduct even. It is not just a critique of anti-Black patriarchal violence against Black women, but also helps us to understand the connections between anti-Black violence and state-sanctioned justifications for violence against women, trans and gender nonconforming people of color, and Indigenous communities who can be deemed indefensible as well. Were the very same acts exercised by another body in another instance, say on January 6th, of this year, they would more likely be celebrated as the merits of self-determination rather than punished with lengthy sentences of prison time. Kaba's work, like Davis's, like Joy James, combines Black feminist critiques of gender violence with the abolitionist reimagination of what public safety could look like. And I put those three together, even though the stakes, politics, and ethics of their protocols of animating that critique are totally different and worth studying. So important not to collapse the difference between these different Black feminist political projects in abolition, but notice their lineage as connected, as interconnected. So Kaba coins No Selves to Defend as a critical way, and I'm wrapping up here, as a critical way of seeing the indefensibility of Black femme selfhood and self-defense in historical perspective. In her essay and art exhibit of the same name, No Selves to Defend considers the case of Celia the slave, whom some of you may know from Saidiya Hartman's work or other studies. Celia, though, if you don't know, was a woman who, in 1855, at age 19, after surviving 5 years of abuse from her owner, defended herself against him, bashing his head in with a stick and killing him before he could rape her again. Though Missouri had laws protecting survivors of sexual assault, the court found her guilty of murder in the first degree, a crime punishable by hanging, for as a slave, Celia was not a person, but property, and she was said to possess no self to defend. Kaba situates this history in the larger context of what she calls, quote, the limitations of culturally authorized ways of knowing. When the only violations we look at are the violations that are authorized by the law, what kinds of crimes does innocence, freedom, and belonging conceal? As Saidiya Hartman writes in her account of Celia, quote, if the definition of the crime of rape relies upon the capacity to give consent or exercise will, then how does one make legible the sexual violation of the enslaved? We might also consider whether the wanton and indiscriminate uses of the captive body can be made sense of within the heteronormative framing of sexual violation as rape. What Hartman, Kaba, and Davis's work make visible are the ways systemic erasure has intimate effects. In addition, then to considering how breaking the silence and telling our stories has become a protocol of political self-defense against the existential and epistemic erasure of systemic silencing, Kaba's Black feminist abolitionism in particular contains congregational protocols of accountability to those with no selves to defend and their oppressors, right? Hers is an ethic of resistance to this legal legacy of punishing survivors that moves us away from the sentimentality and essentialism of sisterhood and its intimate, implicit upholding of gender binaries towards the reality that not all lives matter and not all self-defense is justifiable. And so I think, I think that's the end of the talk. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, there's one little extra paragraph. Abolition, Davis often says, asks us to imagine a world without prisons, without walls. But the question is how? The question is, should they crumble? Will we be ready? Even if we believe and affirm that it is not people who prisons ought to render obsolete, but that people can transcend their reliance on prisons for public safety and render prisons obsolete, then the next question is, then what? How will we manage the cumulative calcified traumas of having lived so long with police, prisons, and caging in a world without walls, in a world without borders? This is what Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower asks us to sit with. And I think, in the 80s when she was writing it, she was worried that we were on a trajectory to exactly when we are, to this time, and that we wouldn't be ready. So, and this is actually something that Angela Davis talks about as well, is that we've been fighting against prisons and policing for so long. And so many of the tactics and strategies of our movement making are saturated with the logics of the thing that we're trying to eliminate, right? So as we win, and I really feel like we are winning, as we win, the most important thing is the protocols. Like, what are the protocols of our protests? What are the protocols of our liberation movements? And how are they imagining a different kind of freedom than the freedom that currently exists? And I think that's what Jacobs helps us think about. And I think that's what helps get us out of the feeling of impossibility or unattainable freedom in the Black, for Blackness in the United States. So long as Blackness is wrapped up in US empire, Blackness can never be free. But what if freedom isn't the thing that we want, right? What if the freedom as we've inherited is calcified, is contracted, is we've grown out of it, right? And so then how do we actually begin to name and distinguish between the kind of freedom that we actually want and the kind of freedom that we have? And how do we begin to do that, I believe, is by going back to those stories and witnesses, testimonies, dreams, poems, dances, movements, sounds of those most directly impacted, to learn from them what it is they meant by freedom before the nation and the national memory consciousness, like through that alchemy of erasure, turns it into a narrative of progress. And that's the work, and I'm really excited to have conversation with you all about it.
Oh, awesome. Thank you very much. I wonder, would you like me to field questions, or can you just select your own?
I think I can just do the questions, especially since it's, yes. Oh, cool. So yeah, if there's just clarifying questions about Jacobs or the story of her escape, we can maybe start there. But I'm happy to field the questions myself. Yeah, we're a nice intimate group.
I actually think that would be a great place to start, like if you do want to say a bit more in that direction.
Oh, just about the narrative itself. So it's such a tricky question because I can just talk for another hour just about that, but I'll keep it short. So in Harriet Jacobs' narrative, like many slave narratives, she starts at the very beginning how she became conscious of herself as an enslaved person. And what's interesting, and I think in another part of this talk about it more, but in the narrative, she doesn't know that she's enslaved until she is 6 years old and her mother dies. And her mother is a domestic slave who is working for a mistress in, I think it's like a settlement house, a hotel kind of place. And her mother says, you know, on her deathbed, will you free my daughter if I die? And the mistress, of course, says yes, and then doesn't fulfill her promise. And there's some ambiguity as to how this happens, but she ends up on her, instead of, oh, right, so she's supposed to release Jacobs on her deathbed. And instead of that, she ends up selling or bequeathing Jacobs to a niece. And it kind of seems as if the person who pursues Jacobs for the first part of her time in much more violent conditions of enslavement might have doctored the will to make sure that he was the beneficiary of her of the mistress's property, which I just found out. So I just think that's really interesting that there is some kind of predatorial relationship already at play before she even came to his plantation. But the story unfolds in this way where she is, 12, 13 years old, and she has already captured the interest of this man, and he is notorious, as she learns, on the plantation for taking enslaved women as his sexual servants. And then as soon as anyone says anything about it or a child is born, that woman is sold. So there's an anxiety that if she consents, she will be separated from her family. And her family is very much part of her entire sense of self, which is pretty typical, but challenging in this context. And so as the story goes, she spends several years avoiding the pursuits of her slave master. And like I said, ultimately he threatens her with either breaking her children, or she could be sequestered in this cottage on the side of the plantation. So she has an option. These are options. And she decides to run away, and she decides to run away in such a way that she can still maintain relationship with her children and her family, so that she can hopefully orchestrate their emancipation. So one of the complex pieces of the story where this notion of something akin to freedom actually emerges is that one of her modes of self-defense in the face of her master's pursuits of her affections is to pursue the affections of another white man who's not her owner. And this becomes the kind of scandal of the text and the reason for her hesitation in even telling her story, because this is not the kind of arrangement that becomes a woman in the Victorian era or today, right? Like the idea that you would strategically have children with a man who is not your master in order to make it maybe possible that your children will not be following in the status of their mother is a complex spot of action for her, and people debate about whether that's agency or not. And so there's so many details, but so in order, this doesn't work. The use of this free white man as self-defense against her owner works for a little while, but eventually the master decides that he wants to break her completely. And so if he can't have her, he will destroy her and sell her children south. And so that's when she decides the best way for me to handle this is to escape and become fugitive. And she hides for 7 years in a tiny attic space in her grandmother's house. And her grandmother is a freed former slave who bought her freedom by baking cookies to the women of the community. The white women of the community saw her as a beloved member of their community, and so helped her make it possible for her to buy her own freedom and that of her uncle. And it's because of those purchases and the purchase of the home that they live in that Jacobs has somewhere to go. So there's some really complex relationships there between the kinds of freedom that come within the regime of exchange authorized by slavery versus those that are outside of the jurisdiction of that economy of exchange that I think are really important to track. At the end of the day, it is a journey to the north that happens only because Jacob's children's father takes their children to the north to become servants for one of his family members. And she has never received from him any written insurance of their freedom from slavery. And he just says, trust me, it's all good. And she's like, yeah, nah, I know how this goes. People lie. People say that you're going to become free, and then they fall in hard times and they have no other options, quote unquote, and you can become property once again. And so she flees to the north to protect her daughter. And together they become fugitives in the north, escaping the fugitive slave law. They end up in Europe for a while, and eventually her freedom against her will is purchased by her employer. And so we get to think about what it means for, this freedom that she has fought for so long to be granted to her in a way that actually reinforces the authority of the slave institution instead of authorizing the fugitive, criminalized, self-determined, collectively created route to freedom that she's narrated. And I think that's really why the narrative is so important, is that it archives a different route to freedom within a formalized system of emancipation. And it says, hey, this formalized system isn't sufficient to telling the story of how I got free. In fact, you have to understand that the freedom that I fought for was criminalized, scandalized, and rendered incredible, right? The fact that people assume that she didn't write it. I remember when I shared this text with my mom, and one of the first reactions she had, and she was ashamed to have it, was she said, I can't believe people were this self-conscious of their condition. And I thought that was, to me, that is enough. That is the reason to do this work and to share the firsthand testaments of those who are most directly impacted. Because if we see them the way that the system sees them, as victims, as objects, as helpless, as abject, then what we miss are all of the knowledges and meaning making that they produce as their everyday practices of survival. Gail.
Unmuted.
Got it.
Thank you for that talk. And I wanted to come back to something you said at the beginning, very, very beginning, about the relationship between self-making, selfhood, and self-defense. And then you went on to talk about self-care as a form of healing justice. And I was wondering if you could talk especially about that relationship between self-defense, self-care, self-making as you see it playing out in both the Harriet Jacobs story and in terms of thinking about abolition today, and some of the more contemporary stories?
Thank you so much for that question. I am working on it. I feel like I don't have a pat answer yet. And part of the reason I made the title of this talk that was to be forced to think about it more. So thank you for that question. I mean, I've been thinking about this Mariame Kaba "No Selves to Defend" slogan for some time. And what comes up for me is that if we have no self to defend, then a congregational defense of self is the only method of survival, right? And what does it mean for our, not just our identity, but our survival to be dependent on a collective mobilization? And when is that actually not true, right? Right. And so then I am thinking about, I spent a lot of time in philosophy focused on German idealism and just really reflecting on the limits of the idea of self that come out of German idealism. And why is it so atomized? Why is it so individuated? So one of the questions I asked when I was an undergrad was, what is the difference between Schopenhauer's idea of the negation of the will to live and Japanese Buddhist idea of nothingness and the negation of the will to live? Aren't they the same? How come they end up in such different places? And so I think I'm still continuing that work they end up in different places, meaning, one ends up in nihilism and the other ends up in enlightenment. And so what does it mean that we have so worshipped individualism that we failed to see how the individual is constituted by multitudes, but not just I contain multitudes, but I am able to be present. I'm able to be here because of multitudes. I'm indebted. And how do we create a politics out of that sense of indebtedness and that accountability to future generations rather than one that really worships at the altar of the individual? And really beginning to see that individualism as delusional and as an abstraction from reality rather than something that is constituted by it. And so there's so many different folks and traditions who think along these lines. And so I'm just really excited to be in conversation with Indigenous studies, with folks doing work on transformative justice, to really see how people in other traditions, and of course in the Dharma, to understand how other people in other traditions are theorizing the self in ways that are not atomized and are not compartmentalized from each other, but interdependent upon each other. Yes, Tad.
Thanks. My question was actually on something else, but just as you said that, it put me in mind of the African concept of Ubuntu. I wonder if you explore, connections to the African philosophical tradition, which seems never to have been tempted by the individualism of the European tradition. But so maybe you can comment on that. But my other question was, I was really impressed with this. I took one of your key messages to be the kind of radical context sensitivity of agency. That what counts as agency can be radically different depending on the moment you are in. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that was one lesson I took from that. And I wonder if there's a bit of a tension there with the kind of collective tools of self-conceptualization that are required for effective action. So what I'm trying to say is, like, if agency means something so different in very different situations to different people in different eras, and yet, collective emancipation requires some kind of identifying some kind of unity. Is that a challenge, a tension that you're alive to, and have, or am I maybe misconstruing the point?
No,
Thank you.
definitely. I think you're helping me think about the point. I think this is really helpful, actually. So because I was in grad school in a period of time where agency was really being destroyed as a concept, I've really shied away from even talking about it in the context of Jacobs at all. But because this is a philosophy talk, I allowed myself to do so. And so what this has brought up is this kind of, right. So there is kind of a relative proximity. So there's a proximity to power that people have depending on their embodiment, depending on their access, their inheritance, all of these things. Identity isn't a fixed, essentialized phenomenon, but a co-constituted one. And so what if agency is about relative proximity to forces of power? And one of the things that I've been thinking about with Joy James, she really pushes my brain. I just can't even say how much she's pushed me to think about the fact that, in this work of abolition, there are a lot of differences in agency and access. And yet, it's so seductive to have everyone who identifies as an abolitionist bear the same mark of kind of radical politics and possibility. And I think this is a mistake because, and she says it's a mistake quite plainly, because there's everyone from Instagram moguls to celebrity activists to those who never get mentioned and whose names are erased from the history, people who are still incarcerated, from the Black liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, who have a perspective and a stake in abolition that is different from those of us for whom this is our day job, right? So literally I am this is my, talking about this is part of what helps me feed my kid and keep paying rent and things like that. That is not the way abolition works for the majority of the people who I'm indebted to for being able to think these thoughts and say these words. And so when I think about agency as something that's connected to collectivity and congregational movement making, what I'm thinking about is proximity to power. So the thing that Joy James talks about is in her work, the womb of the captive maternal and the womb of Western thought. I forget what Western is modifying in that title. She's really thinking about the captive maternal as a source of power that is leveraged towards the uplift, the maintenance, the care, the progress of Western civilization, of modernity. And what if the captive maternal leverages that power towards her own survival and future generations, the survival of future generations? And so when I think about agency, I'm thinking about the fact that, if this bridge is called my back, right? How is it possible for me to become a tool, not even if I am a tool of the master, how can I subvert that instrumentalized purpose towards another end, right? We do have agency and choice in terms of that. And I think that is the lesson that I learned from the everyday practices of resistance on the plantation. This is the book, Closer to Freedom. That's the only one I have to show you. Closer to Freedom by Stephanie Camp has been so helpful in tracking the ways that people subvert the instrumentalizing of their bodies, their labor, their love, their care, by turning it and leveraging it in horizontal ways again towards those who are captive with them. And so if there were a kind of agency that weren't zero sum, right, or absolute or fixed or essentialized, but proximate, then perhaps we can think a little bit differently about the ways agents flock. And so one of the things that we do in abolitionist theory is read Nat Turner's Confessions against, and I'm forgetting the name of the authors, but this really kind of campy but provocative essay that's inspired by the Cyborg Manifesto called the Zombie Manifesto. And it encourages us to think about the kind of agency that we would have if we got rid of our egos, like zombies have, and move as herds. And there's something about that that resonates with me. I think the first time I taught that was during the Egyptian revolutions that were happening in the Middle East. And so much of so much of the depiction of people uprising was made kind of monstrous. And I was captivated by the monstrosity that was associated with people's liberation movements, and started to just think about the ways that people who are fighting for their freedom are often turned into criminals, turned into a mob, turned into a thing that's beyond rational reason, and why is that? Why do we read awakening and uprising that way? And obviously there's good reason to continue to think with that after this last summer.
Thank you. I really appreciate that response, because it actually showed me that the questions I was asking you were actually the same question in a way, in that it's your answer to the agency question referred to a more expansive concept of self and a relational self. So very cool.
That's great. Thank you so much for helping me think about that. Yes, Vanessa.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. I have so many questions. I will pick one. So, I mean, one thing that that for me at least, hearing your talk, I picked up as a kind of through line is the notion of prefigurative politics, right? And thinking about this dialectic of means and end. What is it in the present that's going to allow us to imagine a future, and what kind of future does it allow us to imagine? And then also, what is there in the present that allows us to hopefully actually produce some future, right? And what kind of future? And so, in thinking about Jacobs, we get this kind of particular manifestation of what it might mean to suggest that the end, right, that the goal already exists in the thing that we are attempting to abolish right now. And there was a really like evocative comment that you made where you said that Jacobs allows us to think about dialectics, but a different kind of dialectics where what's under analysis and what we're involved in is a process not of overthrow, but of repair. And so I wanted to hear more about what that means to have a dialectics of repair, and in what ways is that to be distinguished from a dialectic of overthrow?
Thank you for noticing that was something that I was saying. And it's something I'm actually coming to reading Kaba right now. So we're reading We Do This Till We Free Us in a course I designed that's inspired by a book called Captive Genders. And we're really thinking with Kaba about this no selves to defend legacy of the criminalization of those who defend themselves against racialized and gendered violence. And the thing that I've been so moved by is how much compassion is required, how much compassion is required in this alternative to calling the police, right? It's like that if you are going to create communities that can solve problems without the kind of emergency intervention that is accompanied by mercenary force, you really have to be able to build trust across lines of difference in ways that our culture is not accustomed or practiced in doing. And yet, all of these transformative justice projects and initiatives are taking place all over the world. This is really what she's illuminating for me. And they're all improvising on reality. Improvising on reality is a phrase that comes out of the abolitionist theory of George Jackson. And beginning to think about that as like Brechtian, like it's inevitably going to be about trial and error. It's always going to be about failing and failing better. It's always going to be about beginning again. And so I'm thinking about this beginning again as a dialectic of repair, because there isn't an understanding of there is no way out, right? There is, I think the dialectic in Hegel is presupposes a teleology with a telos. And there is no telos in this configuration of time. There is no way out. It's a contained, totalizing structure. And so the only way out is to repair from within. And so beginning to think how these different fragmented, kind of incidental spaces of repair can become contagious, can go viral, is really exciting to me. And it's like literally happening right now. And so, as it happens, as we win, I think it's really important for those of us with a bit more experience thinking about theories of change to help people on the ground name what's different about the kind of praxis that they're engaging from protocols of social change that have come before, right? I think we have a really unique opportunity in this moment of hindsight, of being able to look back at the Black liberation movement, to look back at the civil rights movement, to look back at the movement for abolition of slavery, and look at what didn't work and say, how can we improve upon repair the unfinished work of these social movements and realize them in the present? And so I feel like it is this kind of practice of reflection and action, to use Paulo Freire, to think through a kind of dialectical movement that is driven by ethics as opposed to history, or something like that, with a capital H. But just beginning to think through it. So thank you for that question. Joseph.
Hi, yes, thank you. I have a question that follows from your answer to Vanessa's question. And it's something I was thinking about throughout your talk. And earlier you were talking about zombies. And so why not then bring up the zombie carpenter? There you mentioned the importance of a prophetic tradition. And I'm really interested in that personally. It's funny, this is actually, I have my John Brown mug here. I've been really interested in John Brown lately. And so I found your talk really riveting. And I guess I want to know more about what specifically, how you understand propheticism, especially if in your framework, much of how you are articulating things is rather immanentized with no transcendence. There is no verticality, it sounds like. And so I guess what I'm trying to grasp is, like you told Vanessa, there's no telos in this teleology. that means no eschatology.
Mhm.
How then is it prophetic? How is it messianic?
Right.
So I'm curious to get your sort of. You said you weren't going to talk about the messianic and that sort of dimension, but I'm so fascinated with liberation theology and like
Yeah.
Kelly Brown Douglas's Stand Your Ground book. I think I was thinking of that when you were giving your talk. So I just want to know more.
I don't know that book.
It's pretty good. It's I think it's contesting from a Christian Black womanist theological perspective the idolatry of white supremacism and how there is this inhumane, cruel sacrifice of Black lives, and that sensitivity to the Christian message of God's preferential option for the poor means a very different understanding of standing your ground than the white supremacist one, which is all about defending security.
Yeah.
So it just seemed really resonant with what you were saying. And
Thank you for that. Oh, I would love to. There's so many things I want to add to this liberation theology syllabus, but that sounds really great. And so I guess the way that I think about this is so great. I love philosophers so much. They're my favorite field. I don't get to talk to them very often. So this is a treat. So if this teleology doesn't have a telos, another way to say that is freedom is a constant struggle, which is something that is said in the movement constantly and is, the title of Angela Davis's book. And the reason freedom is a constant struggle is not necessarily because the telos of abolition imagines, that we'll never be able to repair the injuries of all of the systems of oppression that we've inherited. It's because we're human, right? It's because we hurt each other, and the conditions and the contexts of harm right now are so amplified because of those institutions. But it doesn't mean that without those institutions there won't be harm. We're still going to like the 10 commandments come to mind. We're still going to covet thy neighbor's wife, and we're still going to take from people, and we're still going to, like, the things that were problematic for society and for society's endurance will persist, but the ways that we practice accountability for those harms can change, right? And so there is a transcendence in that prophetic vision of repair, but it's not a utopian destination. It's a practice that will be realized, that will yield a different relationship to landscape and horizon eventually. And I think that is the messianism of it for me, is the part where, like, if we don't pick up that message and move it through the portal, then it won't happen. And so that future won't come if we don't create it, if we don't co-create it, if we don't take the time that it takes to co-create it, which means hitting pause on our reliance on security as it is, security, safety, and punishment as we know them. And I think that's kind of what the pandemic has done, is given us a bit of a pause. And what I've been really sitting with this week is what it means to be opening back up. It means like we're opening right back up to mass shootings. We're opening right back up to these like deeply wounded histories that have nowhere to go for healing, right? And so I'm thinking about that as prophetic. And I in the course, in the abolitionist theory, that used to be called prophetic praxis of liberation before it was, when it was sociology. I was in sociology first. And in that, we started to look at the Black prophetic tradition as one that was nation building. We start with Walker. We do work with Douglas and all of the kind of original articulations of Black liberation are prophetic in this way, that are reproducing the paradigms of power that already exist, but antagonistic to white supremacy. And so when we get to Assata, that's when we really see, wait, what if we actually disarm ourselves from the kind of arsenals of power that white supremacy and settler colonialism have passed on to us, and become fugitive to those as well in our articulations, in our strategies, in our tactics for creating a new world? What then is necessary, and how can that become generative of a different kind of theology of prophecy? One that is still marked by, reluctance and persecution and incredibility, all of those things, but is actually ushering in a new paradigm of congregational power as opposed to hierarchical power. So I think a lot of it is about the commons. A lot of it is about a prophetic vision of an elimination of property, an abolition of property. I'm really excited about thinking about like the different kinds of vision of selfhood. Obviously, they're birthed from these kinds of spaces and movements and relationships. And there's some really great work in terms of the transcendence piece in in this book called The Denial of Anti-Blackness. The author Jao Costa does some really brilliant work in helping us think about the transcendent force of Black liberation movements, maybe as not contained within a singular prophet, but in a like kind of mass meaning making of a vision of a horizon that wouldn't otherwise exist. And so I think that's closer to the kind of tradition of prophecy that I think is the tradition that's coming, the tradition to come of Black prophetic tradition, which hopefully will be less interested in territorial salvation or redemption, and more interested in some other kind of protocol of security and accountability.
Thank you. I learned a lot.
Yes, Vanessa.
I figured I'd give everybody a minute. As I said, I have lots of questions. So, something else that I really appreciated about your talk was your discussion of where these ideas come from. So this actually kind of follows on Joseph's question as well, right? Of like, what is this kind of prophecy, and where does it come from, and what creates the conditions, for these prophecies to be made? And you talked about how these come out of the ideas of the Attica Rebellion, right? These come out of prison cells, is where these ideas come from. And I think that's so important, and I'd like you to say more about that and what it, how it sort of shapes the way that we should think about these ideas, and the way that we as academics in an academic space, right, engage with these ideas. It's of particular interest to me for a number of reasons. One of which has to do with a discussion, a comment you made at the end of the talk, where you described how in moments of rebellion, sort of large democratic, congregational, to use your word, movements get dehumanized and treated as a mob, right? This monstrosity. And when we talk about something like the call to abolish the police, it was interesting how, like, right away there was this thought, oh, well, people don't really mean that. They
Right.
didn't think about it. It's just a thing that they say, right? So it's just like very automatic from, you know, a lot of sort of like a kind of like white liberal kind of like space was often where this was coming from. You know, very easy to say, oh, well, obviously they said that because they never thought about it before they spontaneously burst onto the streets in outrage, right? When actually there's this long, long, long tradition of theory about it. And then, you know, I think, you know, more recently, I'm seeing conversations from the other direction that now that these ideas finally have some kind of purchase and uptake in the academy, you know, now I'm hearing, you know, well, this is just some like stuff that some fancy, you know, petty bourgeois academics believe in. But real people out there, you know, they don't have these ideas. And which is wild to me because for a long time, you know, the only time I ever heard anybody talking about police abolition was, you know, in the hood, like what, you know, like going to activist meetings of, you know, of women, usually mostly women, right, Black mothers, talking about their sons, you know, their partners that had been ground under by this system. You know, that's where I was learning about prison abolition, you know. And so anyway, you know, with that kind of like context, you know, I just like you to you know, kind of expound on that a bit about like where do these ideas come from, who's developing this thought, and you know, and what does it mean for how we as academics, you know, what are our responsibilities, and you know, how do we kind of engage with that. I think one of the things that we often struggle with in academic spaces is being willing to take our intellectual lead from people outside of the academy, not just to study them, not just to learn from them, but to be willing to follow them.
That's right.
You know, I think that's something we really struggle with. So yeah, I just want to hear you say more about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a rich, and I think there's a question in the chat, and I'll just read it out loud because I think it might be related. It is no question that the justice system in the US and in capitalism works for the rich and against POC and the poor. Some claim that we need a new justice system that works for POC and workers instead of for the powerful, which includes a form of centralized authority and punishment. Thus, they claim a prison system is a necessary evil to achieve justice. How can abolition lead to a desirable outcome and defend quote unquote freedom without systemically punishing racists, sex offenders, and corrupt bankers? So I think that's a nice kind of complementary question to Vanessa's, to be able to understand, right? So if you don't understand where these imaginations of social change come from, then they do seem romantic or idealistic, right? But the fact that they're actually coming from survivors of rape culture, they're actually coming from survivors of domestic violence, they're actually coming from survivors of the carceral system and criminalization, means that the people who are actually, you know, that you say you're concerned about when you say you're concerned about the murderers and the rapists and the corrupt bankers, right? Even the people that the system currently does not hold accountable. The people who are most impacted by those harms, by the harms of rape culture and predatory lending and racism, are trying to imagine a way of not just punishing people for wrongdoing, but a way to get to the root causes of that systemic harm and stop it in its tracks, stop it for future generations, right? Make it possible that in 5 generations, like one of the organizations that first caught my attention when I was in my 20s before I went to grad school and was doing this work was Generation 5. And their mission was to end child sexual abuse in 5 generations. Now, what does that mean? That means that what we need to focus on is not only the healing and repair of folks who are directly impacted by rape culture and child sexual assault, but to perpetrators as well, right? We need to be in conversation and accountable to their healing as well. And what kind of apparatus, social infrastructure, protocols of repair are required for that kind of work. They are sophisticated, but they're not impossible. And so again and again, what I start to hear is that people are already working outside the protections of the law, because they're not protections for so many people on the margins, to figure out how to defend themselves and keep themselves safe and keep their children safe, and like create a condition of safety for future generations. And so I guess what I'm really excited about when we say we need to be learning from those most directly impacted, that it's not just a deference of political correctness, but actually an epistemological shift in terms of who holds the most insight and knowledge, wisdom, analysis. It's literally an everyday practice. Like as we think about hires, right? So we just had a hire in critical carceral studies. Which is because of the reckoning of the summer of 2020, our dean said, without us at all having conversation about what the priority for hiring might be for Africana, or what kind of the direction of the department might be, the dean said, you're getting a carceral studies hire. You're getting a line, go. And so that was interesting. Yay, a gift, but also, as you all know, in hiring processes, it's incredibly important that you've already had conversation as a steering committee, as a faculty, about who it is you want before you start inviting people to campus, because it's challenging to have those conversations in the midst of filtering through applications, seeing different people speak. And so one of the things that I was pressing for was that it would be great if we could get somebody who is most directly impacted by the criminal justice system. That would be ideal. But having that conflation of most directly impacted and having had access to a PhD, now that is a challenge, right? But that means we have to work that much harder to actually, practice what we preach and walk the talk. And so instead of defaulting to abolition as an intellectual exercise, the Dharma part of this work for me is what does this mean to keep us embodied? And like, what does it mean to keep us accountable in an embodied way, in a real time kind of way? That means that we can't bypass opportunities to actually become accountable to harm, even when it's advantageous on a bureaucratic level, even when it's advantageous on a level of legal liability. It's actually important to interrupt that progress narrative to keep our own accounts of what counts and tell what time it is in ways that might be uncomfortable, but are exactly what Joy James is talking about when she's talking about leveraging the power of the captive maternal against captivity itself. So I invite, I'm really inspired and moved and indebted to the student struggles of the 60s and 70s for ethnic studies. And what was so exciting about that period of time and the way that it was transforming the campus life and the university is that folks were actually hiring activists to teach courses, because the students wanted coursework in areas that professors weren't trained in, weren't expert in. The experts were actually in the streets and on the ground. And I really appreciate that moment. And I'm really sad that moment largely has ended. And so part of what I've been doing on whatever campus I'm on is continuing to press my colleagues, press the students, press the administration to honor and celebrate and compensate activist knowledges in their curricula, in their invited speakers, in their courses. So right now, because I'm going to be on sabbatical in the fall, we're looking to hire an adjunct. And first of all, they were like, well, we have to make sure that the adjunct gets all of the benefits possible. So they shouldn't just be replacing me for a semester. They should be here for the whole year and have a whole course load. And what if one of their courses, they get to be the instructor of record, but the rest of the course is constructed by visitations, like Zoom-based visitations from activist leaders in areas of abolition and transformative justice who have already developed popular education materials so that we can put together a curriculum that's completely fueled by folks on the ground and facilitated by an instructor so that people are getting direct contact. And we did kind of a version of this in the fall following the summer of 2020, and we called it On Mattering, Voices from the Movement and Beyond. And just every week had people come in, activist academics, local organizers, and national organizers, to speak about their work and give the students some context for how to think, how to process, how to be in dialogue with this moment of racial reckoning. And it was so transformative. Students said it was some of their favorite spaces. And of course, I had music and it was humorous, but there was also, like this, it was like a kind of congregational space where people got to think and listen and exchange ideas with folks that they don't typically get to be in conversation with in the academy. And so I've just found that to be one of the Poverty Scholars were the best one, obviously. They're incredible because they use poetry and theater and social theory to get their point, and testimony to get their points across. And it's entertaining as well as, stirring. So I think that's the piece that I'm really excited about. Another project I'm doing right now is partnering, kind of a Harriet Jacobs kind of thing, where I'm partnering with a formerly incarcerated friend and colleague, organizer, and supporting her. She's a transgender, formerly incarcerated woman who is locked up for sex trafficking. But she was the victim of sex trafficking, not rape. So obviously. And so she has a bunch of folks inside who she's in communication with. And so she was like, why don't we have them tell their stories about what self-care looks like inside the prison context? And so I'm going to be like their editor. I'm going to be their, Louise Childs to Harriet Jacobs, and help them come up with this essay that's going to be published in an academic journal. And so I think this is the way to kind of infiltrate. This is really what I understand as my job, is to infiltrate the academy with as many activist knowledges as inspire me to do this work, so that I'm not just teaching as if I learned all of this in a library, but really celebrating the ways in which, if I hadn't walked into critical resistance, if I hadn't, taught creative writing to women behind bars, if I hadn't been doing guerrilla theater when the war in Iraq started in San Francisco, I wouldn't have these words. And the communities that I was with were really the people who created it for me. So I think it's exciting to think about new ways to expand the Ivy Towers, to see how we can put activist knowledge as front and center, and in conversation with our work as well. Tad.
Hi. Yeah. We're probably coming close to the end, and you've been so energetic. But I thought I'd just ask one quick question more, and that is, I really appreciated some points you made where you talk about how we as individuals often, perhaps unconsciously, in our self-conceptions, perpetuate a lot of the sort of structures that bind people, so in light of that, and in light of the concrete example of how people sympathetic with Black Lives Matter sometimes say, well, that's why we need the police and we need these old forms of policing to hold the people accountable who are creating injustice. To what extent is self-transformation, kind of internal self-transformation, a part of this emancipatory project of which you speak? Because it seems like there might be a big role for that. Okay, I'll let you speak.
Huge. And I think, I don't even know the degree to which self-transformation is necessary because I'm learning it as I go personally, right? But there's just so many kind of, everyday ways that we have internalized punitive justice as a politics of security, belonging, etc. I think cancel culture is probably one of the most obvious, like call out culture and cancel culture are probably some of the most obvious ways that we perpetrate the very logics of carceral punishment that we say we want to disrupt and abolish in the movement. And it's really challenging because, as I said, this is a practice of beginning again and again and again. And part of what's so challenging about that is that when new people come into the fray, one has to empathize with what it was like to first come into this work and empathize with what the kind of questions folks have, right? And you have to answer them again and again and again. And if you come with I've done this a million times, I'm getting impatient, you actually lose an opportunity to help someone else in their process of self-transformation and making these connections. And so I've noticed that I have to check. I have become so intimately aware of how much the Academy has curated and shaped what I understand as a process of learning and holding knowledge. The idea that you should get to a certain point after which you no longer have to be questioned. Mastery is such a strange orientation to knowledge because things are changing around us all the time. Things are arising that we don't understand. Things are unfolding that are uncertain. Mastery is not something that actually helps us stop asking questions or expecting to not know. One of the biggest questions I hear from faculty is, I just really don't want students to ask me a question I don't know the answer to. And my reaction to that is like, what, but how, what, really? Like, what about you as a person does that compromise? What about us as people, as human beings, does that model, if that's what you're afraid of, is looking and sounding wrong? Like, to me, that is a really constricting relationship to achievement and success in this culture. And I really want to undo it. So I challenge my students to, not be performative in their presence in my class. Like, I'm not going to be impressed by the amount of times you quote Foucault or something like this. Like, it's really important to me that you be vulnerable and be embodied and you be present and you stay curious and you be generous with yourself when you get something wrong, because inevitably we're going to misstep. And so part of the transformative justice work is like, okay, so how can our reaction to failure not be punishment, but self-transformation? This is great new information. One of the things that my co-author, Reverend Angel, just said in a talk that I heard her give this week, and I love her axioms, they're my favorite. One of her axioms, her new ones, is it's not failure, it's feedback. Like, how do we work in our bodies to be able to confront, to face failure, not as a reason to go into a shame spiral, but as an opportunity to receive feedback from life so we can change and grow and evolve, as opposed to saying, you're done, canceled, right? Like, that's just really unfortunate that we've embodied that kind of reaction. So that's how I think about it, as something that has to happen at the level of the personal. And what I have found is that those punitive, negative stories and logics and impulses are pretty much gonna just be there. Like, you're not gonna be able to stop them. So you actually have to, like, that's what I use meditation and yoga and contemplative practices for, is to disrupt them long enough, like the Garrett space, for something new to enter the frame, so that I'm not always reacting to them in the same habituated way, because if I react to them in the same habituated way, the shame spiral is inevitable, right? But if I pause and like focus on the wind or like listen to my breath, I might create enough capaciousness in my consciousness to notice that there's another choice in that moment.
Very cool. That very much resonates with me. So I don't know if there are any other questions. I'm really thoroughly enjoying this, and I could keep going, but you know, it's not like we're paying Jasmine that much money. So so you know, I don't want to exhaust our speakers. So maybe if we could take one more if there's someone with a really pressing question, but otherwise we should probably, sadly, uh, thank Jasmine for her wonderful talk and conversation.
Well,
Anyone with anything to add?
at the end, I hope we get to be in conversation more, and I get to, you know, visit next time you have your Sophia lecture. And like I said, I just treasure every moment I get to be in conversation with philosophers. It's the field that helps me think outside the kind of constraints and logics of this world. And so I just really enjoy it and deeply enjoyed this conversation. I'm so glad it was recorded. So hopefully you'll send me the recording so I can type it up and put it to my book prospectus or whatever. And yeah, just really enjoyed meeting all of you and hope that we can stay in communication. Feel free to reach out anytime.
Ashley will definitely send the recording, and Jasmine, you're always welcome with us as well, even if it's not the next Sophia. So please, if you're ever in the nation's capital, drop by, and we would love to hang with you. And this was just fantastic. I also want to really commend Gail and Vanessa for this wonderful choice of Sophia speaker. It's I really got a lot out of this. So thank you so much. And I guess take care of yourselves. We'll be seeing each other, I hope. Bye-bye.
Take good care.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Thank you, B.
Hope you have a good rest now that
Yes. Right
take
after
care.
the talk.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Oh, bye, Rebecca. Did you have a question, Rebecca? Oh no, she.
Oh, I'm the host now. Okay. Well, all right. Bye.
Bye.